Hello and welcome to Speechies Talk About. This is series 2 and we're talking about how can supervision be different. And today I've welcoming 2 guests together. So thank you to Kate and Fatimah for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you. It's really lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining. Now, I don't know who wants to go first, but I'd love to hear, if you weren't speech therapists, what might you have been?
I honestly have no idea. Yeah, I think I would be doing something in maybe a caring kind of capacity in a role
Yeah.
where you work with people. But I
Mm.
think there's so much you can do out there, isn't there? I don't think I would necessarily even know. I don't think I think every day it changes for me.
Yeah, that's still something with people and caring.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Kate, what do you think?
I think if you asked 18-year-old me, it would be something to do with animals. So possibly like
Mm.
a zookeeper or something like that. Um, if I had my time again now, knowing what I know now, I probably would have studied psychology. Um, I imagine clinical psychology, just because I'm really intrigued in people and what makes us do what we do and people's stories and all that sort of thing. So,
It's a very popular answer for speech therapists, I have to
is it
say. Yeah.
interesting? Yeah, yeah.
I think there's just so much crossover. There's lots of crossover
Massive.
between our roles.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So today we wanted to speak a bit about both of your experiences of supervision and how it can be different. So can you tell me a bit about your relationship with clinical or professional supervision, either as supervisors or supervisees, actually?
Yeah. Shall I go first, Fatima, or would you like
Yeah,
to?
yeah. You can go for it. Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess I'm here today thinking from the position of offering supervision to different practitioners and of being supervised myself. And I think for me, being an autistic practitioner, um, being autistic has really shaped how I've experienced supervision, particularly around what I would kind of phrase and how I understand it, predictive processing. So I think as a supervisor, but also as a supervisee, a lot of the time, I think I found myself trying to work out what is expected of me here? What does a
Hmm.
good answer sound like as a supervisor, or in answer to a supervisor's question to me as their supervisee?
Mm.
What kind of reflection is this person looking for in either role? And when those expectations aren't made explicit, my brain fills in the gaps, but not always accurately. So I might over prepare, over explain, kind of second guess myself in the moment, because I'm trying to
Mm.
reduce the uncertainty that's essentially present for me. And I think that's where supervision for me has sometimes tipped into performance, not in like a conscious way, but in a kind
Mm.
of regulatory way. Like I'm trying to align myself with what I think the space requires rather than actually staying with my own thinking and just using it as a space to externalize and make sense of things. So I think it's been really important over time for me to gradually notice that and
Mm.
recognize that it's not just about me as an individual, it's about how a space is structured, whether I'm on the receiving end or I'm providing the supervision. Um, and so, as a supervisor, I think I'm much more intentional about making those things visible. So, being clearer about what supervision is for, what's welcome in the space, what reflection might look like in different forms,
Mm.
and giving permission for not knowing or for
Hmm.
things to come out a bit half-formed,
Hmm.
particularly as the majority of people that I supervise are neurodivergent themselves. So, making
Hmm.
space for the externalizing and just seeing what happens.
Yeah.
Because actually that's where the useful thinking usually is.
Hmm.
It just doesn't always sound polished straight away, and that's okay.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, so part of that sort of neuro-affirming practice being explicit about that space and
yeah,
welcoming the
yeah,
unpolished answers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
And can I ask, what helped you develop that skill? Was it training courses? Was it your own supervision and reflection, or a bit of a combination?
I'd say that it was definitely some of my own experiences of being supervised. So for me, I access clinical supervision from different people who I guess are serving different purposes for me.
Yeah.
So I'll have supervision from some people who are also speech and language therapists, and that might be in relation to my dual qualification with the sensory integration bit. But then I also access supervision from psychotherapists and clinical psychologists in relation to kind of neurodiversity affirming and anti-oppressive practice. So,
Mm,
absolutely, I think particularly from outside of speech and language therapy, I have learned a lot that's
mm,
influenced how I then show up. And then I
mm,
think the larger influence has actually been the journeying, I guess, that I've been on for several years now in terms of neurodiversity affirming practice, but wider than that, anti-oppressive practice. And so just connecting and learning from a really diverse range of lived experiences. So not
mm,
just kind of narrowing that down, but really looking broadly. So reading, listening, attending webinars, social media posts, everything that's kind of
mm,
speaking to experiences I don't have particularly has been
mhm.
instrumental, I think, in my crafting of different sort of skills and ways of being in a space with people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that constant drive, I guess, for information and
Yeah.
looking to improve, yeah, practice and how supervision can really facilitate that.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
absolutely.
so
And
interesting.
the privilege of getting to supervise and be supervised by other neurodivergent practitioners because I see the supervision relationship as a two-way thing. So,
Mm,
it's I learn so much from the people that I'm privileged to share space with who aren't necessarily all speech and language therapists. So, um,
mm.
there's so much richness in those experiences. So there's learning all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, so the cross-professional supervision adds something, but you're
Mm.
still able to meet the needs with your speech therapy colleagues as well,
Yeah.
mixing. Yeah, I'm hearing more people talk about that actually, how much they're
Yeah.
gaining from not just one supervisory relationship or one form of supervision.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fatima, what about
Yeah,
your relationship with supervision?
I think for me it's been a real journey, and I think there's lots of themes about the things we've been talking about already. For example, having lots of different avenues of supervision and like those relationships. For example, I've accessed some really fabulous group supervision, which I've found to be
Hmm.
really meaningful alongside my full-time role, and that's been really, really nice. It complements lots of things because there's people with different layers and levels of experience there, and I think being able to listen to people's perspectives and different people's experiences, even if they're not all speech and language therapists, is
Hmm.
really valuable just to develop your own skills. Um, I think for me, supervision overall it's like just been something that's evolved actually. I think there's been times it's been very nourishing for me personally, where it feels like a very safe and brave space. And you can think and you can be challenged and challenge and you can grow as well as a clinician and really develop into the kind of clinician you want to be. And on the flip side, there's been times where it feels a little bit more costly or a little bit more, there's more of an invisible demand there per se, where you feel like
Hmm.
sometimes there's there's been things in the space which make it feel hard to name what those things necessarily are. And it feels
Hmm.
like actually what I've come to learn is supervision is very much relational and very much it's never just a professional like transaction. That's very much based in relational work and it's a relational space and it is shaped ultimately by different systems and powers and identities and that's influencing what we want to bring and what feels safe to bring and how brave you feel to bring something. Um, and I think that really anchors us where we are today and the things that we'll hopefully be speaking about.
Mm. Yeah,
Mm.
so like I've heard the word journey from both of you and evolution and yeah, it's again, throughout the series, there's been a really common theme that everyone's saying supervision isn't one thing at one time, and what works for you at one time might not work for you at another time, or a mix of things might actually really bring more. Yeah.
Mm,
And
yeah.
how would you describe your approach to supervision?
I think mine is very much values based, and I feel like
Mm,
it's all about, who people are in their full identities and what they bring as people. And I think that maybe is reflections of what I am as a therapist. I don't think, I think being a good therapist for me and the therapy that I want to give to people is about accepting people as their full, who they are as they come to the therapy room,
mm,
accepting their full identities of whatever that might be. And I think that also reflects in supervision, and being able to explore those different aspects, what shapes that part of perspective thinking, or what lived experience does that contribute to, or has it come from per se. But I think it's all about your identities and your values and who you are as people, which really shapes the kind of thoughts and like thought processes you have.
mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen
I
a lot of
just
nodding there.
Yeah, just it's just making me think and kind of reflect on in terms of like my approach to supervising other people, just how much that again has been informed and developed and continues to develop over time with learning around anti-oppressive practice and thinking about creating spaces where supervisees can bring as much of themselves as they're comfortable to into that space, and my
Hmm.
role in trying to co-create that kind of environment with them. So, how that speaks to the responsibility that I have as a supervisor with, particular lived experiences of my own, but also certain lived experiences that I will never have, that
Mm,
some of my supervisees may have. And so, what does that mean in terms of my responsibility for thinking about unconscious biases, and how am I raising my awareness around things that I may otherwise have not thought about because privilege has dictated I haven't had to, and I
mm,
wouldn't have had language for that, not too many years ago. So my responsibility to look inward and to
mm,
think about what I can do to disrupt some of my own conditioning, and that's I think a continuous journey. I don't think it has an end point necessarily. Um,
mm,
but
And I
like,
think, go on.
no, go on, Fatima.
I was just going to say, I think from conversations we've had previously and some of the work we've had the opportunity to do, and just like our own reflections as therapists, I think I speak for maybe both Kate and I when I say we're really grounded in anti-oppressive practice, and we
mm,
try to ingrain that into who we are as people, who we are as clinicians, who we are as just general human beings, and recognizing that it means we're thinking about how the systems of power and equality show up in our work throughout all different avenues, in the one-to-one direct work, in the reports you write, in the supervision.
mm,
And I think one helpful avenue that I've thought would be useful for me to start doing that work was thinking about my own positionality and thinking about things that I'd internalized, and
mm,
recognizing that all of our identities, but my identities especially, are not incidental to how I practice. It's just woven throughout how I practice because of who I am.
Mm.
mm,
Um, and recognizing that has been really, I guess, fundamental in knowing how I then approach things like supervision. Because once you have the language for things and once you can name things, it feels a little bit easier.
Mm.
yeah.
And I think like some of what you're saying, Fatima, is making me think about like how we can like professionally sanitize spaces or
Mm,
create an expectation that people present a sanitized version of themselves, where people are um, in multiply camouflaging in different ways potentially.
mm,
And I think when we strip out identity and lived experience, we don't make a space neutral. We might make it more comfortable for some people, but we're also simultaneously making it more costly for others,
yeah.
potentially to different degrees. And I think you can really feel that. in the room. And I don't think it's about, eradicating harm, because from my learning, that would has led me to believe that would be an unreasonable thing to suggest is even possible. But you can certainly name that harm might occur, and actually, how do we develop skills in terms of like accountability and repair, and how do we stay
Yeah.
in the rupture to repair, and where does responsibility sit, and how does power and privilege kind of show up in those different relational spaces, um,
Hmm.
which are inherently designed for growth and developing skills and thinking around your clinical practice, but you bring all of yourself into that space.
Hmm.
And I find it really interesting that consistently over the years, there's just reoccurring themes amongst the people I supervise of needing to bring their personal lived experiences of their work experiences into the supervision space if they're comfortable to do that, because it is a place to process and make sense of things that sometimes have really landed really heavily for them because they are neurodivergent and they're working
Hmm.
within these systems and structures. So you shouldn't need to leave that at the door just to
Hmm.
continually center your caseload, for example, like because you don't leave yourself, in the
No.
office when you go to see a child or an adult you're
Yeah,
working with or whatever.
Yeah. And I think,
absolutely.
Kate, you spoke there about like this cost, and it feels like this invisible cost. Like you can't see it necessarily, but you can definitely feel it. And you
Hmm.
know, you can sometimes, when you walk into a room, and you can. It's like, oh my God, this feels awkward, and it's that feeling, isn't it? Where
Yeah,
the energy it takes to translate yourself into what you feel is safe or brave.
Yeah.
To present the version of yourself that fits whatever you feel the expectations are, means that your energy for then actually doing the reflective clinical supervision is then taken away. And if you spend, a significant proportion of the time just thinking about how to present yourself, thinking about all the like the am I saying the right thing? Does my face look like it's saying the right thing? Am I sitting the right way? Am I asking enough questions?
Yeah.
Doing
yeah,
all of that exhausting work, then what is the supervision? What supervision is taking place? Because really, you're just
mm,
spending more time thinking about how you might be being perceived, and then you're not doing supervision. That's something other than supervision, really, isn't it? And
Mm.
we need to
yeah.
maybe think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it illustrates why the structure of spaces is important to consider as well, as much as the intention behind it, so like who is setting the agenda, whether silence is held as thinking rather than treated as absence, or in fact, does silence need to be defined? Because for some people, their experience of that might be really uncomfortable, and it's not really helping them to think.
Hmm.
So, do social rules and norms within that space need to be outlined? Can reflection take different forms? Like, I don't think any of these things are bringing fidgets into supervisions, drinking, sitting how you need to sit comfortably to regulate. Like,
Hmm.
I don't think Fatima and I, that for either of us, that we see those as small details. Like, I think they're we would both agree, and we've talked before about how they're actually really important, and they're the difference between a space that works for everybody or works better for everybody, and one that quietly only works for some, probably, who belong to more dominant groups as well.
Hmm.
So they're
Yeah.
not small details, they're actually really important foundational relational safety building factors.
Absolutely. And like you say, that supervision can be enormously powerful, but only if it's a safe space in which for supervision to occur. And the trickle down effect as well of how can you show up as a practitioner without personal burnout or reflect on the interactions with your client's child or adult if you're on a performance mode that's not allowing that energy or space for them and that translational thinking as well.
Mm.
Yeah, I think they're really important and difficult things to consider because ultimately it doesn't matter how long you practice or how much you do it, there is always going to need to be more learning, more reflection. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
And that brings us on a bit to, and I think we've started to talk about it, the idea of intersectionality. How does intersectionality show up in supervision?
I think it's a really good opportunity for us to even define intersectionality
Mm,
and for anyone listening. But it's a really, really useful um, framework or lens to be thinking about. And sometimes the term intersectionality gets used a little bit loosely, so it's really helpful for us to define it properly because then it doesn't just get used as a, throwaway word. But the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, but it's been used for centuries before then, as well. And really, at its heart, intersectionality is just that we don't live single identities. We are whole people, and we have multiple identities at any one time. We don't operate in just single boxes.
mhm,
But it's the recognition that, being a black woman is different from being a white woman, and the privilege and possible oppression can be different. And then if you add additional other pieces, for example, like disability, sexuality, class, religion, or beliefs, and all those other layers into it, your experiences of potential privilege or potential oppression can either be increased or decreased. Um,
mm,
and we experience those things not just because of one factor, like I said, but because we have multiple identities at any one time. And that
mhm,
I think Kimberly Crenshaw did say something along the lines of when we do not name the intersection, we then can't see the harm. And that's true in supervision as it is in any other part of clinical practice too. It's really important to name these different forms of privilege and oppression. Um, because once then we name it, we can see the harm and we can try. Just even being able to see the harm is really, really powerful, and being able to have space for that is a fantastic avenue to start moving things forward or even being able to process and sit with those things.
Mm.
mm. And as you mentioned before, the sitting with it is in order to repair. Um,
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think something that you mentioned earlier, Zoe, that I just noticed something coming up for me, and I think Fatima's kind of speaking to it with what she's just described as well, that in the group supervision space that I facilitate, we talk about in our initial session together, we talk about the idea of trying to develop over time a brave space as opposed to a safe space. And
Mm,
and I know it's something that Fatima and I've spoken about in and kind of thought about for different spaces that we've shared as well. That it's a concept that was developed by I think Brian Arau and Christy Clemens, if I remember rightly, who I believe are like kind of social work focused lecturers, I believe, over in America, if I remember rightly. And it's essentially challenging the safe space kind of concept, where still within those spaces, the dominant groups, the dominant norms, structures, etc., can still be platformed and kind of speak over, minimize more marginalized and historically oppressed identities and experiences. Whereas the brave space is encouraging us to, for example, stay within that rupture that's occurred and to think about accountability of the dominant group perhaps, and what they need to develop skills in, what they need to kind of accept ownership of, and how we can
mhm,
work towards repair, rather than expecting historically and persistently oppressed and marginalized groups to have to just kind of push past something or pretend it didn't happen, suck it up or
mhm.
whatever. So
Yeah.
um like and in those group supervisions, we've actually witnessed some really good live examples of that unfolding, where we have got dominant identities within the group, and we are essentially, there's the opportunity to practice developing skills in that accountability bit that we ordinarily might not have had to. Um, and I think that speaks to something that where I see intersectionality most clearly in supervision is in those really subtle, everyday kind of judgments that happen without us always noticing. So, like, whose silence gets read as thoughtful and whose gets read as disengaged or, not contributing, whose communication style is seen as confident versus challenging. And again, they're not neutral. They are shaped by assumptions about what professional looks like, assumptions that have their own cultural and racial dimensions to them. And I think it supervision provides an opportunity to disrupt, to think about things through a more politicized lens. And I know that Fatima and I certainly engage in that within our own supervision spaces and in, offering supervision as well. Um, because, like Fatima said, we don't live single issue lives
No.
as ourselves, but nor do
Mm.
the people that we work with.
Yeah.
So it would be remiss of us to, again, expect those things to be left at the door and to just
Mm.
talk about the speech, language, and communication aspect. With
Yeah,
But I mean, communication is everything, though. We communicate our identities through our language, but also through our body language, through the way we dress and move. And like you say, if we leave any part of that or mask any part of that, that is effort, and effort that could be redirected. Um, and the more that you have to manage, the more unequal the situation.
mm,
It feels like the harm just layers up. It kind
Yeah.
of
yeah,
piles on and multiplies in some situations, unless it's named and others take responsibility for, you know, unloading
yeah.
that.
Mm.
And I think if we think about things like epistemic injustice and like the information and theories around that, we can supervisees can sometimes be wronged perhaps in their capacity as like knowledge thinkers or knowers by questioning what credibility they have, or if they're considered as being ill-equipped with whatever they present in supervision, just necessarily by thinking about how if their experiences are only framed through a supervisor's theoretical lens, or if their knowledge um, rooted in their own lived experiences is treated as like a little bit anecdotal rather than being valuable and being a valuable bit of insight that we wouldn't necessarily always have if we didn't have them bringing that lived experience to us.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can, it can genuinely be unintentional, and it can just be something that happens subconsciously and we're not even necessarily always aware of it. But the impact is significant, and there's really significant consequences of that happening as well. Um,
Mm.
for supervisees, even if it isn't, if that's not how it's intended to be.
Mm. So, what does affirming anti-oppressive supervision look like? And especially, can it be managed when you don't share the same identities?
I think it's a real invitation for us all to get curious and to think about what that means.
Mm.
And I think I want to just maybe gently push back in this space on shared identity being a prerequisite of anything, because I think it can sometimes be a way of, sorry to say, avoiding the work. And I don't think we always need a shared identity, but we need things like cultural humility,
Mhm.
curiosity, compassion. And that's where the important distinction is for me, because cultural humility isn't just like cultural competence. It just implies that you can, because competence just means you just learn about something, you tick it off, you've done that bit of mandatory training, you
Yeah.
can skip it for the next year or 3 years until the next notification comes up of having to do some more cultural competency training for some people.
Yeah.
But I think humility for me and compassion is more about being lifelong. It's more about being holistic. It's thinking about the everyday for that person and being curious, questioning your assumptions, thinking about the privilege that you might have or what your lived experiences bring to the table, and accepting that as therapists, as clinicians, as people in this ever evolving profession, that we're always a learner. And that's as true in the clinical space with children and adults as it is with the supervision and supervisory relationship. And I think it's just the opportunity to always remain curious and always be willing to grow and listen and learn.
Mm.
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 Yeah. And I think
Absolutely.
that there's something I think in it around like that curiosity and openness. So, like I think if we're thinking practically, I know for myself and some of the supervisory relationships that I have, that, upon that kind of initial contact where somebody's reached out via email to ask about supervision, um, my general process is to offer like a free short kind of meet and greet. I say short, I'm really rubbish at doing anything short. Like, don't know why I even bothered saying that. Like, probably at least 45 minutes, might be an hour. And and that's okay because I supervise a lot of neurodivergent practitioners, many of whom one of their communication styles and preferences is info dumping, as is mine. So, of course, it's going to be more than a 20-minute discovery call, and that is cool. I have that within my gift to say, I'm fine with that, and let's make space for that. So there's a practical
Yeah.
example, but having that space to meet with somebody to just think about what they're looking for, what I do and do not provide, because I'm never going to be a supervisor you're going to come to talk about speech sounds, but I'm all over, stuff to do with autism, relationships and sex education, etc. Um, and that's okay. Um, and to think around what makes us who we are, and so how are we going to share space together? So, like if there if there are differences in our lived experiences, can we name some of those earlier on and think about how we will manage any ruptures? How, what might feel comfortable that they may be able to say to me, or I can say if I am aware that I've said something, and how might that sound? How might the space look in terms of, do we need to have longer than an hour? Do we need to think ahead of what the talking points are and use a talking mat in the session? Or is it that somebody, is more than happy to just kind of externalize and verbally talk about whatever is showing up for them? So I don't think that a lot of the practical ways of approaching things in an anti-oppressive and affirming way are necessarily massive or cost anything, or are kind
Mm,
of rocket science. I think a lot of them are actually the really small details but can be really impactful. And just asking people, what do you need, how will it feel for you,
mm.
and giving a space to just name upfront some of those things if it's comfortable to do so. um but
And I
Fatima,
think,
I don't know what
yeah,
that makes you think of anything.
I was going to say, I think what you said really well is that just letting people bring who they are as people to the supervision
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
giving permission for that. Some like I know it sounds silly, doesn't it? Giving permission to bring who you are, but actually,
Yeah.
some people have never had that,
Yeah.
and never been given permission explicitly to be who you are as people. And I think there's a lot of research going on right now about quote unquote professionalism and what professionalism
Mm,
means, and fitting into a nice tidy box. And I think giving people permission to be who they are as people is really, really powerful.
Mm.
Um,
mhm,
and I think you also spoke a little bit there, Kate, about like repairing the supervisory relationship. And I think in any form of relational work, there's always times where we think, oh, that didn't land as I thought it would be, or oh, that didn't go down as what I thought it would have gone down well in my head. But when the words came out, the mouth words didn't make sense to the head words and all that sort of stuff. And I
mm,
think sometimes the really powerful moments I've had is where it's just been called out and just saying, "Oh, I've been thinking about what I said last time, and I didn't get that quite right." And just having that level of accountability and just having that somebody can reflect and listen and think about those things, I think that can be really transformative for people as well.
And isn't that, Fatima, that there's a distinction there between that kind of idea of allyship and
Mm.
solidarity? So, like, I think allyship can often be performative, and, essentially you're talking about a verb. It's about doing. It's
Yeah,
not about positioning yourself as one of the good ones because you have a badge on your lanyard. And solidarity is different. It's relational and it's ongoing. So, stay in the discomfort, return to the difficult conversation, be accountable in the moment or over time, not just when it's easy or visible. And I think stay in it. So like, for me and thinking about anti-racism work, that I think it's Nova Reid that speaks to the fact that like you will never get a certificate. There isn't an end point. And the more I read, learn and unlearn and relearn and learn for the first time and whatever it is, the more I really feel that and that's cool. Like, because actually we don't live single issue lives, and so things are so kind of interlinked and overlapping that, of course, you'll never be finished because there's always an association to make to something else, to another form of oppression, or identities that are constantly politicized and marginalized, as sort of so many of our client groups. So yeah, how can you like stay in that and just keep on doing the work,
Mm,
however that may look, um, challenging
yeah.
the performativeness. I think, it's again, through my own learning, I think there's an element, from what I understand, of you'll be in that performative place. You might be in it for a while because you're doing the learning and you're practicing and developing skills that aren't necessarily inherent. So of course, some of it will be performative, but how do you stay with it to eventually move past that and build your confidence in showing up in more of an anti-oppressive way?
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a commitment from people never to stop that journey, isn't it? To
I
or
think so.
remain curious and open and
Mhm.
reflective.
I think so.
Um,
And I think, Fatima, did you say something earlier about, this, I can't remember how you worded it, sorry, but how this isn't just, we're talking about supervision and it's obviously a really important part of our practice, but this isn't just about how we show up in supervision. This is
Mhm.
about the decisions that like my wife and I are making about our personal life and the things we do and what we engage with. So it extends beyond, because I don't know, hopefully there's something within you um that connects with everything we're talking about. So it's helping to therefore move past that performative.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So I think actually, Kate, some of the things you've been talking about, one maybe really useful, tangible resource that people listening might want to reflect on are the zones of practice. There's quite a few out there, and they're all really, I think, accessible and very visually friendly in terms of moving through the different like zones and thinking about how you can move through them and develop your own skills or develop further as a person, clinician,
Mm.
practitioner. So yeah, just for anyone listening, if you find that helpful, then feel free to use those. But they're widely and freely available online.
Mm.
Yeah, good shout.
Oh, that's great. And I know, thank you. You've said that you'll supply some definitions and key references as well that we can add to the show notes that will help people. So thank you both. That's been such a rich and interesting conversation. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. And I just wondered if there were any final thoughts you wanted to leave people with.
Yeah, Fatima.
I'm happy to go. Yeah. Um, I think for me, what this entire discussion has been about, and what some of the work we've done historically together, Kate, and maybe even the discussions we've had as a collective with yourself as well, Zoe, is really that supervision isn't neutral, just like any other space. It's not neutral, and it never has been. It either reproduces systems that we're all operating in, or it actively works against them. And I think actually it's a really exciting opportunity and it's a really exciting thing because it means that every supervisory relationship is a unique opportunity to do something a little bit different, to
Mm,
create a space where someone doesn't have to shrink themselves or perform or translate themselves, and actually where their whole selves are valuable and are encouraged and are welcomed. And I think that really is fundamentally the work. And I think it starts with each of us, who we are as people, just being willing to examine what we bring to the room and what we bring on the day and what we bring every day to our clinical roles and our, as our practice really. So yeah, for me, that's my closing final note.
And
thank
I
you.
think I echo a lot of that, to be honest, particularly. the point around supervision is never neutral, and it's never just about a case in front of you or something like that. I think,
Mm.
the work that we do, it is political. Nothing about what we do is neutral. So I echo everything that Fatima's just said. And I think two words that kind of are really sort of spotlighted for me are curiosity and responsibility. So curiosity about ourselves, about the norms that we might be reproducing without realizing it, highly
Mm.
likely, and about what different people might need in order to feel able to think and speak and show up more fully, and responsibility for making that visible where we can. I think because when supervision feels more human, more flexible, more able to hold all of that complexity, that it creates a ripple effect, I think, not just
Mm.
for the practitioner, but for the people that they then go on to work alongside and support.
Mm.
And yeah, I don't think we can or should underestimate that ripple effect in my
Mm.
practical kind of day-to-day experiences of seeing it happening. I don't think
Mm.
you ever know where that ripple is going
Yeah.
and the change it might create, and conversely, the harm it could recreate.
Mm. Oh, that's such, thank you so much. Such great summary of the conversation with you both. Um, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope people out there find it really useful. And if you are looking for a new supervisory relationship, I hope that you will look to the supervisor register, where people have committed to ongoing CPD and reflection on their own supervision. You can find it on the intandem.co.uk website. Thank you very much for listening.